The eviction notice trembled in Marcus Chen's hands as Karen Whitmore's perfectly manicured finger jabbed at his chest. "You have 48 hours to tear down that fence, or you're out," she shrieked, her voice echoing across the suburban street. What she didn't know, what nobody in Millbrook Heights knew, was that the quiet man she'd been tormenting for months wasn't just another homeowner. He was the county's chief land assessor, the man who determined property values, zoning violations, and had the power to make her $1 million dream home worthless with a single keystroke. As Karen stormed away, Marcus pulled out his phone and made a call that would change everything. "Sarah. It's Marcus. I need you to pull the complete file on 4247 Elm Street. Yes, the Whitmore property. And Sarah. Flag it as priority 1. Marcus." Chen had always believed that good neighbors made for a peaceful life. For 37 years, he'd maintained that philosophy through 3 different homes, 2 divorces, and countless minor disputes that were resolved with handshakes and shared beers over backyard fences. But Karen Whitmore was testing every ounce of patience he'd cultivated in his 45 years on Earth. The morning started like any other Tuesday in Millbrook Heights, the kind of pristine suburban neighborhood where lawn care was a competitive sport and HOA violations were discussed in hushed tones at the local coffee shop. Marcus stood in his kitchen, sipping his first cup of coffee and watching the sunrise paint his backyard in golden hues. The 6-foot privacy fence he'd installed 3 months ago cast long shadows across his vegetable garden, the tomatoes and peppers thriving in the protected space. It was a beautiful fence. Cedar planks, professionally installed, with proper permits. And a survey that confirmed it sat exactly 18 inches inside his property line. He'd done everything by the book, a habit that came naturally after 15 years as the county's chief land assessor. When you spent your days reviewing property disputes and zoning violations, you learned to dot every I and cross every T. The pounding on his front door shattered the morning calm like a brick through glass. Marcus set down his coffee mug and glanced at the clock. 7:23 a.m. He moved through his modest 2-story home, noting the precise thuds that suggested someone was using their fist rather than the doorbell. Through the frosted glass panels flanking his front door, he could see a familiar silhouette, tall, angular, with blonde hair pulled back in a style that probably cost more than his monthly grocery budget. Karen Whitmore stood on his doorstep. Like an avenging angel, her face flushed with righteous fury. She wore a cream-colored blazer that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, and her leather handbag hung from her shoulder like armor. Behind her, Marcus could see her husband Dale hovering near their matching BMW SUVs, his expression a mixture of embarrassment and resignation. "We need to talk," Karen announced the moment Marcus opened the door, not waiting for an invitation before pushing past him into his foyer. The scent of her expensive perfume filled the space, something floral and sharp that made his nose itch. "Good morning to you too, Karen," Marcus said, closing the door with deliberate calm. "What can I do for you?" "Don't give me that polite routine," she snapped, spinning around to face him. "You know exactly why I'm here. That fence is coming down, and it's coming down today." Marcus had known this conversation was inevitable. For 3 months, ever since the installation crew had finished their work, Karen had been finding reasons to complain. First, it was the height, too tall, she claimed, even though it met all local ordinances. Then it was the color, too dark, she said, even though it was natural cedar. Last week, she'd insisted it was blocking her view of the mountains, despite the fact that her house sat at a lower elevation than his. "The fence is completely legal," Marcus said, keeping his voice level. "I have all the permits and the survey confirms it's on my property." "Legal doesn't mean right," Karen shot back, her voice rising. "Do you have any idea what that monstrosity is doing to my property values? I've got potential buyers coming to look at the house next week, and they are going to see that wall of wood blocking their view of your yard." "I'm sorry if the fence affects your enjoyment of your property," Marcus said carefully, "but I have the right to privacy in my own backyard." "Privacy?" Karen's laugh was sharp and bitter. "You want privacy? Move to the mountains. This is a community, Marcus. We all have to live together, and that means considering how our actions affect our neighbors." The irony wasn't lost on him. In his professional life, Marcus dealt with property disputes almost daily. Neighbors fighting over lot lines, fence heights, tree branches that crossed property boundaries. He'd seen it all, mediated countless disputes, and helped draft many of the very ordinances that protected his right to build the fence. But here, in his own driveway, he was just another homeowner facing down an angry neighbor. "I understand your concerns," Marcus said, "but the fence stays." Karen's face darkened. "We'll see about that." She turned and stormed toward the door, but paused with her hand on the handle. "You know what your problem is, Marcus. You think you're better than everyone else. You think you can just move into this neighborhood and do whatever you want without considering the people who've been here for years." "I've been here for 8 years," Marcus pointed out. 8 years of keeping to yourself, 8 years of acting like you're too good to join the community. Dale and I have tried to be welcoming, but you've made it clear you don't want to be part of what makes this neighborhood special." Marcus thought about the HOA meetings he'd skipped, the block parties he'd politely declined, the numerous invitations to join the neighborhood book club or tennis league that he'd turned down. He'd always been a private person, preferring the solitude of his garden to the social obligations of suburban life. But he'd never been rude about it. "I'm not trying to be antisocial," he said. "I don't care what you prefer." Karen interrupted. "What I care about is protecting the investment I've made in this neighborhood. Do you have any idea what Dale and I have put into our home? The renovations, the landscaping, the improvements. We're not going to let some antisocial neighbor destroy everything we've worked for." She yanked open the door, but turned back one more time. "You have 48 hours to tear down that fence, or I'm calling the city." "The city will tell you the same thing I'm telling you," Marcus said. "The fence is legal." "We'll see about that too." Karen strode down his front walk, her heels clicking against the concrete like gunshots. Marcus watched her march across the street to her own house, where Dale was waiting with the expression of a man who'd had this conversation before. Marcus closed the door and leaned against it, feeling the weight of the morning's confrontation settling in his chest. He'd dealt with difficult people in his professional life, developers who thought they could bully their way past zoning laws, homeowners who insisted their property lines were different from what the surveys showed, contractors who cut corners and hoped no one would notice. But those were business relationships, bounded by professional courtesy and legal frameworks. This was personal. This was his home, his refuge, his one place in the world where he was supposed to be able to find peace. He returned to his kitchen and poured himself a fresh cup of coffee, then stepped out onto his back deck to survey his domain. The fence stood straight and true, its cedar planks weathered to a soft gray that blended naturally with the landscape. Beyond it, he could see the corner of Karen's perfectly manicured backyard, the pool with its infinity edge, the outdoor kitchen that had probably cost more than most people's cars, the professional landscaping that looked like it belonged in a magazine. Marcus understood why Karen was upset. The fence did block the view between their properties, creating a barrier where once there had been open sight lines. But that was exactly the point. He'd grown tired of feeling like he was living in a fishbowl, tired of Karen's not-so-subtle hints about his yard maintenance, tired of the way she and Dale would stand on their deck and comment on his gardening choices loud enough for him to hear. His phone buzzed with a text message. Marcus pulled it from his pocket and saw a number he didn't recognize. "Mr. Chen, this is Dale Whitmore. I'm sorry about Karen's behavior this morning. I'm hoping we can work something out. Would you be available to talk later today?" Marcus stared at the message for a long moment. Dale had always seemed like a reasonable person, quieter than his wife, more diplomatic in his approach to neighborhood conflicts. Maybe there was a way to resolve this without things getting worse. He was typing a response when his phone rang. The caller ID showed his office number. "Marcus, thank God you answered." The voice belonged to Sarah Martinez, his assistant and the most competent person he'd ever worked with. "We've got a situation developing with the Riverside Commons project. The developer is claiming we made an error in the property assessment, and they are threatening to sue the county." Marcus felt the familiar shift that came with transitioning from personal to professional problems. "What kind of error?" "They are saying we undervalued the wetlands on the eastern section of the property. Apparently, they think it should have been classified as buildable land." "I reviewed that assessment personally," Marcus said. "Those wetlands are protected under state Sarah Martinez had worked for the county assessor's office for 12 years, and she'd never heard that particular tone in Marcus Chen's voice before. It was controlled, professional, but underneath the calm exterior, she could detect something. That made her sit up straighter at her desk. "The Whitmore property," she repeated, her fingers already flying across her keyboard. 4247 Elm Street. "I'm pulling it up now." "I want everything," Marcus said. "Original purchase documents, building permits, property tax records, any complaints filed, any violations noted. Everything." Sarah's screen filled with data as she accessed the county's property database. "This is going to take a few minutes to compile. Are you looking for anything specific?" "I'm looking for problems," Marcus said simply. "And Sarah?" "This stays between us for now." After Marcus hung up, Sarah stared at her computer screen with a mixture of curiosity and concern. In all her years working with Marcus, she'd never known him to abuse his position or use his access to county records for personal reasons. He was the most ethical supervisor she'd ever worked with, the kind of man who wouldn't even let her expedite his own property tax appeals. But something had changed. Something had pushed Marcus Chen past his legendary patience, and Sarah had a feeling that whoever owned 4247 Elm Street was about to discover what happened when you crossed the county's chief land assessor. The Whitmore file was extensive. Dale and Karen Whitmore had purchased the property in 2019 for $847,000, a relatively modest price for Millbrook Heights. But the real story was in what they'd done since then. Sarah scrolled through building permits, each one representing a substantial investment in the property. A pool installation that had cost $125,000. A kitchen renovation that had required structural changes to the house. A guest house that had been built in the backyard. An outdoor kitchen and entertainment area that had tripled the value of the outdoor space. The total investment in improvements was staggering, over $400,000 in permitted work alone. But as Sarah dug deeper into the records, she began to notice discrepancies. The guest house had been permitted as a storage shed, but the electrical and plumbing permits suggested something far more complex. The outdoor kitchen had been approved for a simple barbecue area, but the gas line installation indicated a full commercial-grade cooking facility. The pool had been permitted as a standard residential installation, but the engineering documents showed a complex infinity edge design that should have required additional approvals. Sarah printed out each discrepancy and highlighted the relevant sections. By the time she'd finished her review, she had a stack of documents that told a troubling story, a story of homeowners who had systematically misrepresented their improvements to avoid proper permitting and inspection requirements. Her phone rang at 7:30 p.m., just as she was preparing to leave for the day. "Sarah, it's Marcus. Have you had a chance to review the file?" "I've been going through it for the past 2 hours," she said, looking at the stack of papers on her desk. "Marcus, there are problems. Serious problems." "What kind of problems?" "The kind that could result in significant penalties and reassessment of the property value. Maybe even orders to tear down unpermitted improvements." There was a long pause. On the other end of the line, when Marcus spoke again, his voice was carefully neutral. "Compile everything into a report. I want it on my desk first thing tomorrow morning." "Marcus," Sarah said carefully, "this is about more than just property assessments. Some of these violations could be criminal. Deliberate misrepresentation of building permits, unpermitted electrical work, possible health code violations with the septic system modifications." "I understand the implications," Marcus said. "Prepare the report." After Marcus hung up, Sarah sat in her empty office, staring at the evidence spread across her desk. She'd worked in county government long enough to recognize the signs of a brewing storm. The Whitmores had built their dream home by cutting corners and bending rules, banking on the assumption that no one would look too closely at their permits. They'd been wrong. Sarah worked late into the evening, cross-referencing building codes, checking permit applications against actual construction photos from the county's inspection database, and documenting every discrepancy she could find. By the time she finished, she had a comprehensive report that would change everything for the Whitmores. Meanwhile, across town, Karen Whitmore was having a very different kind of evening. She sat in her professionally designed living room, surrounded by the fruits of her meticulous home improvements, and plotted her next move against Marcus Chen. "He thinks he can just ignore us," she said to Dale, who was trying to watch television, while she paced back and forth across their Italian marble floors. "He thinks he can put up that fence and ruin our property values, and we'll just accept it." "Karen, the building inspector said the fence was legal," Dale said wearily. "Maybe we should just let it go." "Let it go?" Karen spun around to face him, her eyes flashing with indignation. "Do you have any idea what we've invested in this house? What we've put into making this neighborhood a place where people actually want to live?" Dale did know. Every improvement, every renovation, every upgrade had been Karen's idea, driven by her vision of creating the perfect suburban paradise. The pool, the outdoor kitchen, the guest house, all of it had been about establishing their place as the premier property in Millbrook Heights. "We'll take it to the county," Karen continued. "Property values are a county issue, and they'll have to listen to us. We'll get that fence classified as a nuisance, and we'll get it torn down." "Karen, I really think you should reconsider." "No." Karen's voice was firm, final. "I'm not going to let some antisocial neighbor destroy everything we've built here. Tomorrow morning, I'm filing a complaint with the county assessor's office." Dale watched his wife continue her pacing, her determination evident in every step. He'd learned over the years that when Karen set her mind on something, there was no talking her out of it. But he had a bad feeling about this particular crusade. The next morning, Marcus arrived at his office to find Sarah waiting for him with a thick folder and a cup of coffee. "The Whitmore report," she said, placing the folder on his desk. "Marcus, this is extensive. I've documented 17 separate violations, ranging from minor permit discrepancies to major structural changes that were never properly approved." Marcus opened the folder and began reading. The first page was a summary of the violations, organized by severity. The second page was a breakdown of the financial implications, potential fines, reassessment penalties, and the estimated cost of bringing the property into compliance. "The guest house is the biggest problem," Sarah continued. "It's been connected to the main house's electrical and plumbing systems, which makes it a secondary dwelling unit. That requires special permits, inspections, and compliance with rental property regulations." "Are they renting it out?" "According to the county's short-term rental registration database, no. But according to Airbnb, yes. They've been operating it as a vacation rental for the past 8 months." Marcus looked up from the report. "They are operating an illegal short-term rental." "Gets worse," Sarah said. "The septic system modifications weren't properly permitted. They expanded the system to handle the additional capacity from the guest house, but they never got approval from the health department. That's a potential groundwater contamination issue." Marcus continued reading, his expression growing more serious with each page. The Whitmores hadn't just cut corners, they'd systematically violated building codes, health regulations, and zoning ordinances. What they'd created was a beautiful, expensive, and completely illegal residential compound. "What's the total exposure?" Marcus asked. "Conservatively, $75,000 in fines and penalties. But if they are ordered to tear down the unpermitted improvements and rebuild them to code, it could be closer to $200,000. Marcus closed the folder and leaned back in his chair. In his 15 years as county assessor, he'd seen plenty of homeowners try to skirt the rules. But the Whitmores had taken it to a new level, creating a web of violations that would take months to untangle. "What's our next step?" Sarah asked. Marcus was about to answer when his phone rang. The caller ID showed the main county office number. "Mr. Chen. This is Linda at the front desk. I have a Karen Whitmore here who says she needs to speak with you about a property assessment issue." Marcus glanced at Sarah, who raised her eyebrows. "Tell her I'll be right down." Marcus took the elevator to the main floor, where he found Karen waiting in the public seating area. She was dressed in another expensive outfit, a navy blue suit. That probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, and she stood up the moment she saw him approach. "Mr. Chen," she said, extending her hand with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm Karen Whitmore. I believe we need to discuss a property assessment issue." Marcus shook her hand, noting the firm grip and the way she held eye contact. Mrs. Whitmore. What can I do for you? I'd like to file a complaint about a property improvement that's affecting the values in my neighborhood, Karen said. Specifically, a fence that's been erected without proper consideration for the impact on surrounding properties. What's the address of the property in question? 4239 Elm Street, Karen said. The owner has put up a. The Postal Service delivered the certified mail at 10:17 a.m. on a Thursday morning that would forever divide Karen Whitmore's life into before and after. She signed for the thick envelope with the casual confidence of someone who had never received anything more threatening than a jury summons, chatting pleasantly with the mail carrier about the weather while her world prepared to implode. Dale was at work, managing his dental practice with the same meticulous attention to detail that had made them successful enough to afford their dream home. Karen was alone in her kitchen, sipping her second cup of coffee and planning her day around a tennis lesson and lunch with the neighborhood book club when she opened the envelope from the county assessor's office. The first page was official letterhead, dense with legal language and county seals. Karen's eyes skipped over the formal salutations and administrative jargon, looking for the summary that would explain why the county was writing to her. When she found it, the coffee cup slipped from her fingers and shattered against the Italian marble floor. Property violation notice, multiple building code violations requiring immediate compliance. Karen's hands trembled as she read through the list of violations, each one accompanied by photographs that had clearly been taken during a professional inspection. Her guest house, her beautiful, expensive guest house that had been featured in the local Home and Garden magazine, was listed as an unpermitted secondary dwelling unit. Her outdoor kitchen was classified as commercial food service installation in residential zone. Her pool was described as non-compliant infinity edge construction. The financial implications were spelled out in brutal detail. Fines totaling $47,000. Immediate cessation of all short-term rental activities. Requirement to obtain proper permits for all improvements, with associated fees estimated at $23,000. And if the violations couldn't be brought into compliance, orders to demolish the unpermitted improvements entirely. But it was the signature at the bottom of the notice that stopped Karen's heart completely. Marcus Chen, Chief County Assessor. For a moment, Karen stared at the signature, convinced she was misreading it. Marcus Chen was her neighbor, the quiet man with the annoying fence, not a county official with the power to destroy her financial stability. But the letterhead was real, the photographs were real, and the signature was undeniably authentic. Karen sank into one of her designer kitchen chairs, the violation notice scattered across the marble countertop like evidence at a crime scene. Everything clicked into place with the horrible clarity of a nightmare becoming real. Marcus wasn't just a homeowner, he was the county assessor. The man she'd been harassing for months, the man she'd threatened and belittled and ultimately filed a complaint against, held the power to determine property values throughout the county. And she had just handed him every reason he needed to destroy her. Karen's phone rang, startling her from her paralysis. Dale's name appeared on the caller ID. Honey, I've got a break between patients. How's your morning going? Karen looked at the violation notice, at the photographs of their beautiful improvements, at the signature that had just turned her world upside down. Dale, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, you need to come home. Now. What's wrong? Are you hurt? Just come home, Karen said. Please. Dale arrived 30 minutes later, still wearing his dental scrubs and carrying the worried expression of a man who'd never heard that particular tone in his wife's voice. He found Karen sitting at their kitchen table, staring at a pile of official-looking papers with the fixed intensity of someone trying to make sense of a foreign language. Karen, what's going on? She handed him the violation notice without speaking. Dale read through the first page, his expression shifting from confusion to concern to horror. This can't be right, he said. We have permits for everything. You handled all the paperwork yourself. I had permits for some things, Karen said quietly. I may have simplified some of the applications. What do you mean, simplified? Karen looked up at her husband, seeing her own fear reflected in his eyes. The guest house permit was for a storage shed. The outdoor kitchen permit was for a basic barbecue area. The pull permit didn't include the infinity edge modifications. Dale stared at her. Why would you do that? Because the RAL permits would have taken months to get approved, Karen said, her voice gaining strength as she tried to justify decisions that suddenly seemed criminally stupid. Because they would have required engineering studies and environmental impact assessments and all sorts of expensive consultants. Because I wanted to get the work done before the summer season. So you lied on the permit applications. I simplified them, Karen insisted. Everyone does it. The contractors said it was normal, that nobody checks this stuff anyway. Dale sat down across from her, the violation notice spread between them like a roadmap to financial ruin. How much is this going to cost us? If we can get everything properly permitted, maybe $70,000. If we can't. Karen's voice trailed off. If we can't, they can order us to tear down everything that's not in compliance. The guest house, the outdoor kitchen, the pool modifications. Everything. Dale was quiet for a long moment, processing the magnitude of their situation. Who signed this notice? Karen pointed to the signature line. Marcus Chen. Chen, why does that name sound familiar? Because he's our neighbor, Dale. He's the man who lives across the street. The man with the fence. Dale's face went pale. The fence you've been complaining about for months. The man you filed a complaint against yesterday. I didn't know. Karen said defensively. How was I supposed to know he worked for the county? Maybe because you could have asked before you started a war with him. Karen stood up abruptly, pacing to the window that overlooked their backyard, their beautiful, expensive, potentially illegal backyard. This isn't my fault, Dale. We followed the advice of licensed contractors. We paid for proper installations. We weren't trying to break any laws. But you did break laws, Dale said quietly. You admitted that you lied on the permit applications. I simplified them, Karen repeated, but the words sounded hollow even to her. Karen, look at me. Dale's voice was firm, the tone he used. With difficult patients who needed to understand the seriousness of their situation. We are in real trouble here. This isn't about simplified paperwork or contractor advice. This is about systematic violations that could cost us our house. Karen turned from the window, her perfectly composed exterior finally cracking. What are we going to do? Before Dale could answer, their doorbell rang. Karen looked through the front window and saw a man in a county uniform standing on their doorstep, carrying a clipboard and a camera. More county people, she said. Dale answered the door, finding a building inspector who introduced himself as Tom Morrison, the same inspector who had examined Marcus's fence just days earlier. Mr. Whitmore. I'm here to conduct a follow-up inspection regarding the building code violations identified in yesterday's notice. I need to examine the guest house, the outdoor kitchen, and the pool area. Do we have a choice? Dale asked. Not really, Morrison said apologetically. The violations are considered serious. Enough to warrant immediate inspection and possible enforcement action. Dale led Morrison through their house and into the backyard, where the inspector began a methodical examination of every improvement Karen had been so proud of. He photographed electrical connections, measured setbacks, tested water pressure, and documented safety violations with the thoroughness of someone building a legal case. Karen watched from the kitchen window as her dream backyard was dissected and catalogued. Each photograph Morrison took felt like another nail in the coffin of their financial stability. The electrical work in the guest house is going to have to be completely redone, Morrison explained to Dale as they stood near the structure that had cost them $75,000 to build. It's tied into your main panel in a way that violates current codes, and the amperage requirements exceed what your service can safely handle. What does that mean? It means you'll need to install a separate electrical service for the guest house, which requires trenching, new meter installation, and complete rewiring. You're looking at $15,000 to $20,000 minimum. Dale nodded grimly. What about the pool? The infinity edge creates a safety hazard because it doesn't have proper barriers. You'll need to install additional safety features or modify the design to bring it into compliance. The pump system is also oversized for residential use. should have been classified as commercial installation. Morrison continued his inspection for another hour, documenting violations that Karen had never imagined existed. By the time he finished, the list of required modifications had grown to include structural changes, electrical upgrades, plumbing modifications, and safety installations that would cost well over $100,000 to complete. "Is there any way to appeal this?" Dale asked as Morrison prepared to leave. "You can file an appeal with the county commission," Morrison said. "But I have to tell you, these violations are pretty clear-cut. Your best bet is probably to work with the assessor's office to develop a compliance timeline that won't bankrupt you." After Morrison left, Dale and Karen sat in their living room, surrounded by the fruits of their real estate. The Millbrook County Commission chambers had never seen anything quite like the spectacle that unfolded on the third Tuesday of the month. What should have been a routine property violation appeal had transformed into the kind of public drama that would be discussed at neighborhood barbecues for years to come. Karen Whitmore sat at the appellant's table, flanked by two expensive lawyers whose combined hourly rate exceeded most people's monthly mortgage payments. She wore a conservative navy suit and an expression of carefully controlled dignity, but the tremor in her hands as she shuffled through her legal documents betrayed the desperation beneath her composed exterior. The hearing had been scheduled for 2 o'clock, but by 1:30, the commission chambers were packed. Word had spread through Millbrook Heights with the efficiency of a neighborhood gossip network. The story was too delicious to miss, the HOA queen who'd terrorized her neighbor, only to discover he was the county assessor with the power to destroy her $1 million dream home. Dale sat in the front row behind Karen, his face ashen with the knowledge of what this hearing would cost them regardless of the outcome. The lawyers alone had already billed $15,000 and they hadn't even begun to address the actual violations. He tried to convince Karen to accept Marcus's compliance timeline and work quietly to resolve the issues, but she'd been adamant about fighting what she called a personal vendetta disguised as official action. Marcus sat at the county's table with Sarah Martinez and the county attorney, a stack of files and photographs arranged with military precision. He wore his usual professional attire, khakis, button-down shirt, and the calm expression of someone who'd done this countless times before. But the stakes had never been quite so personal. Commissioner Janet Rodriguez called the hearing to order at exactly 2 o'clock, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd seen every kind of property dispute imaginable in her 12 years on the commission. "We are here today to consider the appeal filed by Dale and Karen Whitmore regarding building code violations identified at 4247 Elm Street," Rodriguez announced. "Mrs. Whitmore, you have 30 minutes to present your case." Karen's lead attorney, a silver-haired man named Harrison Clark who specialized in municipal law, rose to address the commission. "Honorable Commissioners, my clients are here today because they've been the victims of a targeted harassment campaign disguised as legitimate code enforcement." Clark launched into a presentation that had clearly cost thousands of dollars to prepare. He displayed charts showing property values in Millbrook Heights, photographs of the Whitmore's improvements, and testimonials from neighbors praising the positive impact of their renovations. He argued that the violations were minor technicalities that had been blown out of proportion by a county assessor with a personal grudge. "The timing of this enforcement action cannot be ignored," Clark declared, his voice rising with practiced indignation. These violations were allegedly discovered just days after Mrs. Whitmore filed a legitimate complaint about a fence that was negatively impacting her property values. "This is classic retaliation, plain and simple." The audience murmured appreciatively. Clark was a skilled performer, and he was telling a story that cast Karen as the victim of government overreach and personal vendettas. But Marcus noticed that the attorney was carefully avoiding any discussion of the actual violations themselves. Furthermore, Clark continued, "My clients were advised by licensed contractors that their permits were sufficient for the work being performed. They acted in good faith, relying on professional guidance, and should not be penalized for technical errors in paperwork." Clark concluded with a passionate plea for the commission to overturn the violations and allow the Whitmores to continue enjoying their home improvements without the crushing financial burden of retroactive compliance. When Clark finished, Commissioner Rodriguez turned to Marcus. "Mr. Chen, please present the county's position." Marcus stood and walked to the podium with the measured pace of someone who had truth on his side. He activated the projection system. and displayed the first photograph, an aerial view of the Whitmore property showing all the improvements in question. Commissioners, this case is not about personal disputes or technical paperwork errors, Marcus began, his voice calm and factual. This case is about systematic violations of building codes that exist to protect public health and safety. Marcus. Click to the next slide, showing the guest house. The structure at issue was permitted as a 120 square foot storage shed. What was actually built is a 600 square foot dwelling unit with full kitchen, bathroom, and sleeping facilities. This isn't a paperwork error, this is deliberate misrepresentation. The audience grew quiet as Marcus methodically presented the evidence. Each photograph was damning, each permit comparison showed clear deception, and each building code citation demonstrated serious safety violations. The electrical connection to this guest house creates a fire hazard, Marcus continued, displaying photographs of junction boxes and wiring that made even the non-experts in the audience wince. The septic system modifications were made without health department approval, creating potential groundwater contamination. The commercial-grade outdoor kitchen operates without proper ventilation or fire suppression systems required for food service facilities. Marcus paused and looked directly at Karen. Mrs. Whitmore claims these were innocent mistakes based on contractor advice. But the evidence shows a pattern of deliberate deception designed to avoid the time and expense of proper permitting. He clicked to a slide showing the Airbnb listing for the guest house. Mrs. Whitmore has been operating an illegal short-term rental business, advertising her unpermitted guest house to tourists while claiming it's just a storage shed. This isn't a mistake, this is conscious fraud. The commissioners exchanged glances. This was worse than the typical property violation case they usually saw. Mr. Chen, Commissioner Rodriguez said, what is the county's position on the appellant's claim that this enforcement action is retaliatory? Marcus had been waiting for this question. Commissioner, the enforcement action was initiated based on a routine cross-check of building permits against property tax assessments. This type of review is conducted quarterly throughout the county, and violations are processed without regard to the identity of the property owner. He clicked to another slide showing the inspection timeline. Mrs. Whitmore filed her fence complaint on Tuesday morning. The building violations were discovered during a routine database review on Monday afternoon. The inspection was conducted on Wednesday as part of our standard process. The timeline shows that the investigation began before any complaint was filed. Karen's face flushed red. Her lawyers had built their entire defense around the retaliation claim, and Marcus had just destroyed it with simple documentation. But Marcus wasn't finished. However, I think it's important for the Commission to understand the context of Mrs. Whitmore's complaint against me. He activated a new slide showing photographs of his fence from multiple angles. Mrs. Whitmore filed a complaint claiming that my fence was negatively impacting property values in her neighborhood. This fence was built with proper permits, professional installation, and full compliance with all local ordinances. It stands 18 inches inside my property line and meets all height and setback requirements. Marcus paused, looking at the packed audience. Mrs. Whitmore filed this complaint not knowing that I am the county assessor, the person responsible for determining property values throughout the county. She was essentially asking me to rule that my own legal fence was somehow damaging property values. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Several people in the audience chuckled, while Karen seemed to shrink in her chair. The fence complaint was thoroughly reviewed and found to be without merit, Marcus continued. But it did prompt me to review Mrs. Whitmore's property more carefully, which led to the discovery of the violations we are discussing today. Commissioner Rodriguez leaned forward. Mr. Chen, are you saying that Mrs. Whitmore's complaint led directly to the investigation of her own property? That's correct, Commissioner. If Mrs. Whitmore had not filed a complaint about my fence, her violations might not have been discovered for months or years. The silence in the room was absolute. Karen had essentially turned herself in by trying to cause trouble for her neighbor. Marcus returned to his table, and Commissioner Rodriguez called for a brief recess while the commission deliberated. The audience buzzed with conversation as the dramatic implications of the hearing sank in. During the recess, Karen huddled with her lawyers in an animated discussion that was clearly not going well. Clark's confident demeanor had evaporated, replaced by the grim expression of an attorney who just watched his case collapse in spectacular fashion. When the commission reconvened, Commissioner Rodriguez delivered the verdict with the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. The commission finds that the building code violations identified by the county assessor's office are legitimate and serious, Rodriguez announced. The evidence shows systematic violations that pose safety risks and violate multiple ordinances. Karen closed her eyes, knowing what was coming next. The commission further finds no evidence of retaliatory enforcement, Ro.